Alright, hello everybody. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today's Wednesday, July the 10th. And as I'm recording this video, Venus is in a trine to Neptune in Pisces. Venus is in Cancer, a water sign. And Venus is about to make an ingress into Leo. The planet Mercury is already in the second decan of Leo. So Mercury already made this ingress before Venus, and I neglected to make a video about this. Of course, after Venus makes the ingress, maybe about a week or so later, the Sun will make an ingress into Leo too. They're all, and what you have is you've got Pluto in Aquarius at 1 degree of Aquarius. So every planet that crosses this point is going to hit this opposition to Pluto, right? Now, my last video I made about Venus making the aspect to Neptune, the trine, which is still in effect at the time of making this video, as well as a sextile to Mars and Uranus and Taurus. And I think, first of all, I should mention that it was interesting because I recorded that video in the midst of the French elections, and the result. You know what's funny is that I often get a lot of recommendations for some reason, or the algorithm sends me a lot of like really right-wing websites, and so there's this kind of like. Going into it, I saw this thing where the people were saying that the French leftists were rioting, right? And I was thinking of the Mars, Uranus, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm there's some kind of like, I was under the impression when I recorded that video that the far right was winning in France, and then like after I had recorded that video, the left made a comeback and then made a kind of a alliance with the centrist party to defeat the far right. And at the same time, there's also the Labour Party in the UK got in for the first time for a long time. Although it was there's a kind of question around representation and voting, because they didn't really have that much of a share of a vote, but they made, I guess they capitalized on their strategy, right, of focusing more on getting seats rather than getting the popular vote in the UK. There's that basic, and then of course there's also all this stuff about the American elections with Biden and Trump. And I have to admit that there are certain things around Venus opposite Pluto, as well as Sun, because I mean, Sun usually stands for like the hero or the protagonist or the leader, the king, right? When you put that in an opposition to Pluto, Hades, the underworld, you've got things like crime, corruption, and of course, I don't want to be making my entire video about the corruption of Donald Trump, or there's a sort of problem right now in that Biden is not looking very strong, Trump is looking very corrupt, and also, which is interesting, is that there's this whole thing called Project 2025, which at the time of making my last video, I'd never heard of this. But I was talking in my last video about a 5-year plan, right? I was joking about my mom talking about doing a 5-year plan or something like that. But you know, also this is the whole thing. If you rewind it a little bit further back, when Mercury was making aspects to Neptune and Saturn, I think it started when Mercury was in Gemini, making aspects to Neptune and Saturn. Like I was saying, I need to backtrack a little bit. I've been working with a therapist, and the therapist was encouraging me with my writing, basically, right? And encouraging me to like start like, I mean, I do have a blog that I don't use very much, and I don't use Substack yet. I'm not going to get into my reasons why I'm avoiding blogging or why I'm avoiding writing a Substack. Um, but there's something about how the Mercury was squaring Saturn and Neptune, and I was looking at this in terms of like, look, Saturn and Neptune is very much associated with communism, and this is because the Russian Revolution, the communists, the Bolsheviks taking power in Russia happened under a Saturn Neptune conjunction, and then after when the Soviet Union collapsed and the fall of the Berlin Wall happened, that also happened under a Saturn Neptune conjunction. Although Uranus was there too, so it was like Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus all together equals the end of the Soviet Union. Saturn and Neptune together equals the start of the Soviet Union. So, but there's Saturn and Neptune bookending the Soviet Union either way, right? And based on this, I think you can also look at other communist countries with Saturn and Neptune, but I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of that now. I'd have to do more research. But just in general, Saturn and Neptune stands for important things around communism. And but there's a certain kind of, obviously I'm playing with a certain kind of irony here, because the way it tends to go with, let's say, people who, well, I mean, there are a lot of people into astrology who are, you know, like liberal, leftist, social democrats, but when you talk about like hardcore communism, or Marxism, there's a tendency to look at things from a very materialistic perspective, in that you would say you want to do everything with a kind of surgical precision of rationality, making a very coherent, rational argument, and you don't want to, put your politics onto a kind of a mystical doctrine of like, oh, now that Mercury is aspecting Saturn Neptune, it's time to write a new communist manifesto, right? But if you take away the political, making it all about Marxism or something, that was interesting is the Project 2025. I'm only hearing about this now, but apparently, I don't know how long this has been in circulation. Probably at least a couple weeks before I heard about it, but this is kind of like the same thing from the position of like MAGA Trumpists, although Trump himself is sort of denying it and trying to because I think Trump realizes it makes him look bad, because it's sort of like, it's kind of like the whole deep state problem that Trump or the MAGA people wanted to correct, and now it just looks like obviously there's some kind of a deep state that wants to use, like, if Trump is going to get in, how do we use the Trump presidency to push certain political goals, certain political agendas? One of those has to do with women's rights to abortion rights, right? Or reproductive health in general. And of course, I'm a Canadian, and what's interesting is that we have a surge of the conservatives and the right wing are having a surge of popularity in Canada, but for some reason in Canada, people aren't concerned about women's reproductive health and abortion rights. It's not a political issue the same way that it is in America, right? It's a different climate here. But that whole, I'm bringing this up because Venus is going to ingress into Leo, and it's going to make that aspect to Pluto, and Pluto is all about power, control, manipulation, that kind of stuff. And so when you see Venus opposite Pluto, one of the things that you're going to see is that highlight being put on the abortion rates. And then also, and then there's certain things that are obviously coming up with Donald Trump being affiliated with Epstein, getting in trouble for all that kind of stuff, the corruption of the elite in relation to sexual misconduct or flat. I mean, I think this is kind of odd with YouTube because I don't like. I noticed everybody is using abbreviations like SA or whatever. Different because if you use certain words, you get. I'm not even monetized in the first place, but you know. Don't want to self-sabotage myself by saying all the wrong things, but what the point is that with Venus opposite Pluto, you're going to see. I think this whole thing about how the Pluto stands for something like the shadowy forces, Aquarius being like the systems of government, the systems of control, and the basic issue of control over women or exploitation of women, and the whole thing about Stormy Daniels power, sex workers, women's bodies, reproductive rights. That's all going to come to a head with the Venus-Pluto opposition, and the idea of Mercury having to do with the manifesto part of it. So I mean that's just one thing straight away that's fairly obvious. There's another thing that I was considering about all this where I suppose in France they have. I mean, I'm not here to be like an expert political pundit, but there is a certain. I see the whole situation in France being talked about in terms of a. What can I say? I went to Europe once myself, and I remember talking to people in Europe. This was way back in 2009 that I had my experience in Europe, and I remember talking to people about like the problems of political extremism in Europe and stuff like this. And the Europeans that I was talking to basically told me that it was like, well, there are like far right nationalist fascist parties, and they do win elections and they do get in, but what tends to happen is that they tend to get in with such a narrow margin that they don't really hold. What you get is a hung parliament, basically, right? The hung parliament being that, like, if you have a group of, you'd have to have everybody vote on a certain bill or vote on a certain issue, and if it's really split 50-50, it's really hard to make any progress in passing certain kinds of legislation. And so what you end up getting is like governments that are in power for 6 months or something like that, and then they dissolve and they have another re-election, and then, or that, like, if a political extremist party gets in, they have such a low margin, they can't really do anything, and then usually it collapses, and they elect somebody else eventually, or you have to form a coalition with the centrists, which ends up kind of watering down the political extremism and keeping that center of gravity around the center, right? And there's something about this which I thought, like, I do tropical astrology, so of course, if you're a siderealist or somebody who's whatever, we're not getting into the nitty-gritty, but there's if you apply tropical astrology and also the decans, and I do this thing which I'm not all astrologers are into this particular technique, but I do like the thing where you use the tarot decans, which come from associations that were I think it's usually the Golden Dawn, but it actually goes farther back to the 36 faces, the Decan rulers. This goes all the way back to the Picatrix and stuff like that, where there's these kinds of spiritual forces associated with the three decans. Each sign is divided into three, right? And so, as I said, Mercury's already in Leo 2, but Leo 1 is with tarot. This is where Venus is making the ingress. Okay, Venus is ingressing into Leo 1, and Leo 1 with tarot is associated with this, the Five of Wands. Right now, and it's kind of funny because I'm always tempted. I had this kicking around in my head, the sort of Five of Wands. And what came to mind is, like, there's a meme that somebody like I think it was like it probably could be like tarot shit posting or something like that. It wasn't very serious, but they were talking about Five of Wands as a bunch of guys on acid trying to set up a tent at a music festival, but it's just total chaos. And so for me, it brings up something as a side note that I don't really go to music festivals anymore. But I recommend stay sober. For all those people going to music festivals this summer, stay sober and focus on setting up your camping environment in a sober, rational way before you take any drugs and start partying, or else you get this kind of situation. But more seriously, when you look at the politics going on, the idea of if you look, this is also, if you use the Decan rulers, it's like Saturn ruled Decan, and there's this idea that Leo is a sun, the domicile of the sun, and it has to do with leadership. It has to do with people are talking about Leo likes the spotlight. Leo likes attention. Leo likes to be, and it's like all these guys are kind of like competing for attention. All these guys are like competing for the spotlight, and it's also like in this kind of election political climate, there's this kind of idea that like of having a hung parliament or something like that, where it's like there's such, and I think one of the things that I have noticed listening to New Agers talk, now I'm kind of like, I am what I am, right? I'm like, I have to admit that I'm kind of a bit of a New Ager, but I find there's reasons why I feel like I don't get along with the typical, what you typically associate with the New Age. And that seems to usually be associated with a political thing. Although I have to admit, there are a lot of New Age spiritual people who are a little bit more left or a bit more liberal. And it seems to me like the media tends to create a kind of like a stereotype that's not even necessarily accurate. But there's or it could just be the way that people categorize things in their head. But nonetheless, there's this thing about... I hear this thing always come up where people are talking about the divide and conquer, the society is divided and the division makes us weak, in the sense that this is like, the weakness is like the Saturn rulership of this Decan, right? Where if you were strong, instead of having a bunch of these guys all thinking they're all number one, all scrambling around, in a state of disarray and competitive disorder, you would have one person in a position who's clearly the leader, and basically in a hierarchical delegating different roles in an organized way to actually get something done, rather than having basically a hung parliament with a bunch of assholes who all think they're right and aren't listening to the other guy. And this is where you kind of see there's something about this which I think, you end up having some of these guys are going to have to form a coalition with the other guys, or else they're just going to be looking like a bunch of assholes waving their sticks around, basically, right? And so Venus is about to hit off an opposition with Pluto, and then shortly after that, about a week or so, you're going to get the Sun doing the same thing, hitting off this opposition. And I was also kind of riffing off this in another video I did, where I was talking about this book that this one called Dividuum, about machinic capitalism and molecular revolution. And I haven't read anything, but there's something about, so often we talk about the divisions in terms of like political divisions or hung parliament or something like that, or there's a lack of national cohesion or something like that. But this guy, there's a certain focus in this book about the division in terms of finance, or division in terms of a debt economy, division in about how in a capitalist system, where capitalism, as far as I understand it, and I'm no political science expert or anything like that, but capitalism, as I understand it, tends to do with the process of growth, being in a state of industrial technological acceleration, and this sort of like this riding this wave of growth, as well as basically financing, basically lending money, borrowing money, and currently the world economic system is running on debts, right? To the point where, like, and this is the whole thing where it's like, I can't. You were talking about, you want, rather than, I mean, you could look at this whole situation of a political body that's in disarray and everybody's competing with each other and there's no central king and no central rulership. Or you could also look at, your living situation where, many people, most people, a lot of people are probably renting and have to pay money to a landlord, and then the landlord is using that money to pay off the debt that he has on the house, because the house isn't really his. The house is partially his and partially the bank, right? Or you could live at your, the whole, I don't want to get into my whole, I think it's kind of too personal to get into my own family financial situation, but it's like if your family owns the house, but then everything's so expensive with the cost of living that you have to take out either a reverse mortgage or a line of credit on your house, then essentially you are leveraging the property that you have by using that as an asset to get yourself a loan so you can survive in the cost of living. And the thing that's funny is that the way that the economy works is like the Trudeau is basically just trying to be like, okay, well, how can we like make it more easy for people to get loans? And it's not really correcting the whole problem of like massive debt. It's like how, like the only way that the economy can function is to go into debt, right? Because it's like, if you want it's kind of like you need to go to school, but you need to take out a student loan to go to school. You need to drive, but you can't buy a car outright, so you need to finance your car or whatever. Like the idea of actually owning like there's also this question of like communism, which I started out maybe talking about communism and stuff like this. Or like the different political extremes, but there's a issue around communism where people are like, like, we don't want the communists to take all our possessions away, right? Like I like owning stuff. I like having a book collection. I like having a record collection. And if the communists came, they would just take everything away and nobody would own anything and all this kind of stuff. But the way it is with capitalism is that like nobody owns anything anyways, right? With capitalism, it's like you're driving a car and your car isn't even yours. You're paying it off. Or you're living in a house, the house isn't even yours. Or even if you're renting, the house isn't even your landlord's house. The landlord's just using you to pay off the bank, right? And there's so this kind of idea of like being divided or not owning anything. Like that's actually capitalism. In capitalism, you don't own anything. You're just borrowing. You're trying to pay off a loan on your house, and it's like it's like we try to be like, oh, our society is divided because there's too many different people with different we've got too many immigrants or too many different religious belief systems or too many political ideologies. And when no, it's like we've also got like you don't need, nobody actually owns anything in the system because it's all divided to be like, oh, this bank has a stake in it, and your share, you have to, all my money is associated from lending money to these different capitalist interests and all this kind of stuff, and it's like all these people are like the capitalists all competing for your dollar. You're like, why don't you have my stock or something like that? I don't know. I mean, there's another side to the division that's actually inherent in capitalism, right? And that there's a certain thing about like, is it maybe like, why is it so ridiculous? Like, there's something ridiculous too about the Trump and Biden thing being like, this is the best you can do. This is the best we can do. Apparently, we're having, and there's some kind of like sense of disillusionment. I think, right? Being like, obviously this is a bit messy. Like, is it a bug or a feature that you've got like either the most corrupt or the most inept politicians, and like and rather than actually being able to do something where we make changes, it feels like this, right? It feels like a bunch of assholes who, none of them you take seriously, waving their stupid little sticks around, like being like, is this a joke? Like, can we make something happen that is like, makes the situation better? Right? Or do we have to deal with these assholes competing with each other, right? And the idea is that apparently but like, this is actually, by creating this competition, it just means that whoever comes out to the top was going to be the best because he's going to beat all the other guys, right? But it's like, I don't know. There's the other important thing to consider, though, is the Venus. Like, we're going to have an opposition to Pluto and Aquarius, and the first decan of Pluto of Aquarius. What is it? Is this which is in the Crowley deck, they call this one defeat. This is a Venus ruled decan of Aquarius, right? And it's a kind of an odd one because it is Venus is it's like, it has to do with peace. This is maybe like a peace treaty, and it looks like the aftermath of a battle, right? The battle is over. There's the peace, rather than these guys, the battle is very much raging, right? But these guys aren't fighting with swords, they're fighting with wands. So there's a certain suggestion that these guys are battling, they're competing with each other, but they're under, it's like the sun archetype is like, each of these guys thinks he's number one. Each of these guys is kind of narcissistically infatuated with their own perspective, their own point of, they think they are right, and they're not willing to give, like, the one who's going to actually win is the one who's willing to cut a deal with the other guy and gang up on the rest of them, make a team, right? Make a coalition, right? And being able to make the team or make the coalition is effectively overcoming the fragmentation, right? Because this is the idea. The more fragmented you are, the more you think that your opinion of what's right is the objective thing you have to do, as opposed to the other guys. Whereas a coalition is relativizing your own position for the sake of teaming up with another guy to beat the competition, in the same way that in France, the right wing, the far right, was able to be defeated because they weren't able to overcome their own fragmentation, right? They thought that they had the conservatives think that what they're conserving is like the tree, right? The objective truth, the traditions of the noble lineage of aristocracy and stuff. And this is just so true that the rest of the people don't have any chance of competing with it. Whereas the other people are more likely to relativize their own position, right? To say, maybe our position isn't some objective truth. Maybe we're just coming from a kind of relativized perspectivalism. But out of that position, but if we acknowledge the relativity of it, then we're in a position where we're more likely to compromise and more likely to cut a deal with other people to team up against the other guy who thinks he is like, just objectively right, and he's going to be like the next Mussolini or something, right? So, and then in this, what you've got Venus, the Venus ruled decan of a Saturn sign, in that the Saturn is kind of like the quality of, there's a kind of coolness, a kind of coldness, rather than, you think about that, this is a very hot situation. There's a certain kind of inflammatory heat of the moment kind of battle. These people are probably cussing each other out. They're probably they're not holding back. These guys are just going to town on this is the Lord of Strife, right? Going to town on a full-on squabble of competition. All sorts of mudslinging and insults and dirty politics. This is just a bad scene in terms of that. Whereas with this, it's a kind of a solemn situation, where the people are walking away. The guys who have lost are having a bad time, but it's it's peaceful in the sense that the battle is over. There's a kind of a sense of a cool breeze blowing through, and there are people who have given up. I think the Pluto, for me, emphasizes the quality of the swords on the ground, right? Because there's this idea of Pluto of being the underworld and the death and rebirth and the transformation, but there's a certain kind of process where what doesn't work, there's something about like the waste, right? Like the problem too though is that is the waste product, the stuff the ideas that didn't get used, the ambitions that were not able to be realized, or do those things get recycled back into the system and taken up by somebody else, or are they so toxic that they need to be avoided and quarantined and canceled or eliminated or banned or whatever, exiled, right? And there's something also, this is me kind of joking. I don't go to festivals anymore. I'm trying to live a more healthy lifestyle and not party so much and be a responsible adult. I have to say, I do like making music with synthesizers, and I do kind of like the idea of like going out to dance parties. But when I was a young man, like the same thing, you may have the experience of going to a festival and you have to learn to focus on setting up your tent and your camping environment before taking drugs, or else it may deteriorate into a bunch of people tripping out, thinking each of them is like the reincarnation of Jesus, or they're like, these people are like going to be the next Elon Musk, and a kind of state of, this is a manic inflation, right? Each of these guys has succumbed to a state of manic inflation, thinking they're all hot shit. They're all going to be the alpha male, and they're all going to like compete with each other for a kind of like state of all, and this competition is healthy. This is what drives people to be. This is what drives people to peak performance. Basically, is dealing with this sort of chaos of rather than actually building the tent, we're all just going to fight with each other, and whoever wins is obviously the one who's the best at fighting, right? So instead of like focusing on like how do we build a better society? How do we correct the problems? We're just gonna like get into this thing where like huge mudslinging fight, just a bunch of chaotic crowd of people hitting each other with sticks, right? And then versus this is like if these were the guys setting up the tent on acid, this is what they call in the transformative festival, psychedelic festival scene, this is the ground score, right? Which is, do I need to explain what a ground score is, or can I trust that my audience is familiar with the ground? The ground score is, what's funny is that like if you grow up, I'm a resident of British Columbia, right? So even without going to music, the whole idea of the ground score is that on a music festival, there's a high chance that you're going to find somebody's drugs on the ground, right? And so even if you don't have the hookup, you might just find a bunch of random, but then it's also sketchy because for all you know, fentanyl is the big problem, right? And so you're playing Russian roulette basically, right? But the upside is you could get free drugs, or else you're playing Russian roulette and you could get dosed with fentanyl or something. So but the idea anyways is that there are people, the battle of the previous night. This is kind of like this. It's like the beginning of the festival where everybody thinks they're hot shit. Everybody's there to just like, assert his ego dominance, and then, after a night or two of partying, one guy is racking up, whereas the other people have lost their drugs, basically, right? It's not just, I'm kind of just, I can't resist being silly about this, but there's this idea of like where the people who've lost, the idea of like there's certain thing like Pluto being having to do with transformation, right? Being like if your idea doesn't work and you have to give up your idea and try something else, that's because it's like there's something about Pluto which is interesting because Pluto has a lot to do with the id, right? The id being like this the survival instincts, right? And that at there's some basic level where like survival is like the evolution. There's also an interesting problem where that they talk about in this book, which I mention a lot. Can we believe in people? And there's this issue around evolutionary astrology, right? That that concerns the evolution of consciousness, right? And the evolution of consciousness is something that I picked this up mainly from certain Christian authors, right? Being that this guy Stephen R.L. Clarke is a kind of a Christian Platonist, and the guy who does Christian meditation on the tarot also talks in this kind of line. But there's this idea that like evolution is this process of random mutations, right? And then process of elimination through whoever reproduces and whoever doesn't get killed off, right? And the idea of like this kind of evolution kind of follows sort of like law of the jungle kind of mentality for survival, right? And this could be like considered like just like you can draw a line between ordinary evolution, which happens on basic random mutation. Like you have a pool of genes, two different parents, and if they have a bunch of kids, the genes are going to come out in different combinations just randomly, right? And the idea that it's not really like, you know, if there's some sort of genetic factor that leads to one person reproducing more and one person not, then that gene is going to get carried through in it's like kind of an impersonal way. It's just like the idea is kind of mechanistic, right? It's not really like something that you have volitional choice over. And I think Pluto is kind of like that in a way too, in that survival instincts, like, you know, if there's some sort of threat to your physical safety, if there's some sort of threat to your own survival, you're not going to think about it too much. You're going to run. You're going to do what you need to do to survive. Your adrenaline is going to kick in. You know, I think all that kind of basic, those kind of like root chakra, sacral chakra things go with Pluto, the basic, and then like the whole idea of like control and manipulation goes with either playing off people's fears, or there's something really interesting about how like sex and death are interconnected, obviously, because in order to, if we didn't sex, we reproduce to overcome death by having kids, so that we have generations live on and all this kind of stuff. But there's a certain thing about like when you look at what's coming up with all this stuff about Epstein and Trump and political power, and the way that there's something about how, you know, like the idea of like blackmail and stuff like that, about how people are the basically you can't just the way that you can't get away from your fear. Like there's some basic thing about like there's a difference between like psychological fear and being like, oh, I'm afraid to, you know, go out and sing a song and play guitar in front of a crowd because I've got stage fright or something like that, right? Versus the fear of like an actual predator that's going to eat you, right? And that you are, you know, you can overcome your fears in different ways, but at some basic level, you're hardwired to have the fear of a predator that's going to eat you. In the same way, it's hard to overcome the reproductive instincts that drive people to whatever, you know, whatever. And there's some kind of thing about the survival that is rooted into like basic evolution is happening at this level of like over, as long as you don't get eaten by a tiger, you survive and your genes go on to reproduce, right? Whereas the whole point of the evolution of consciousness has more to do with what makes a human being have a more evolved state of consciousness than an animal. And it's argued in this book anyways, right, that part of that, it has to do with the ability to make volitional choices, right? And then, of course, this is the whole can of worms about like whether or not volitional choice is even a real thing, because some people don't even think free will exists, right? Some people think that the whole human process is entirely just what you think is free will is really just a more complicated mechanistic thing of different neurons firing in your brain and different, neural patterns going, right? And then maybe we don't even have free will at all, right? But the idea of the evolution of consciousness is developing that ability of free will, saying that the basic survival level of an animal, it's more about non-volitional reflexes for survival and mating, versus the evolution of consciousness has to do with the ability to make choices that don't necessarily work on that level, right? And so the evolution of consciousness could also be looking at one's own self-interest, right? And this is the whole thing, is that like with these guys, each one of these dudes thinks their self-interest is number one, and but what's kind of funny is like the evolution here is that if somebody is able to like relativize their own self-interest or relativize their own perspective, then that puts them in a position where they're actually more able to form a coalition, team up to overcome the competition. They're like, so it's kind of like, and there's something about like getting beyond this sort of like instinctual, reflexive, this instinct for self reproduction or survival, and being able to have this volitional way to make choices that is like may be, there's this idea that rather than looking at reproduction in terms of a basic biological thing, what if the evolution of consciousness was like, you don't have kids, but you are able to create an idea that is so influential that your idea lives on after you for generations and generations and generations, because it's not like working on this line of like biological reproduction. It's of this sort of like being able to make choices, like being able to create a map or a plan or something like that captures the imagination of people. I don't know, I'm kind of riffing on it anyways, but there's some sort of, what I'm trying to say is there's some sort of like the idea of having creative choices versus something about Pluto. Pluto is like the idea of like the way that all this stuff works with blackmail is trying to be like taking away people's choices, right? Or the whole problem about exploitation, corruption, like exploiting somebody by making them into a slave, by forcing them to do things they don't want to do, but being like, do this or we'll kill you, or do this or we'll expose this thing about you, or like having all these things that you're like, whereas there's some ability to like there's a certain idea of like the evolution of consciousness is also sort of associated with freedom and liberation, where if you are completely have a certain kind of transcendent equanimity, then you can't be controlled, right? And so there's this kind of thing is like, do you have a principle that you stand for that's of a higher importance than having your reputation ruined, or having your having threats made against you, there's some sort of principle that's high, that you have pinned your wagon to a star, right? And having this kind of higher principle representing, or like it could also be like what the Platonists talk about with virtues. Like there's a higher virtue that is beyond the imminent animal survival, and our ability to reach for these higher virtues, or the ability to have so there's this idea that the evolution of consciousness is sort of like transforming people away from this just basic like reproduction survival thing towards having the ability to even just have a different perspective, right? To be able to look at your life situation and tell a different story about it, or have a different perspective, right? But the thing is that the more people are locked into a state of just survival, like how do we pay the bills? How do we survive from month to month? How do we, there's this kind of thing about like, if you're at that level, you're going to be like, if your virtue isn't making it work for you in terms of survival, you drop your ideas, you drop your principles, these are all like the swords that are laid down, and like they're all just ideas that, or you could have all sorts of creative ideas that if you don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. But it's cool, it's fine, because nobody owns an idea, right? The idea is like public, right? Like there's some kind of like, there's all sorts of options, all kinds of inspirations, and there's idea that one man's trash is another man's treasure, and somebody like, there's all this stuff that just goes into the recycling bin, goes into the compost heap, and the idea is that either somebody else is going to pick it up and find some way to do something with it, while the other people look, because these people have not been able to make the ideas work for them, and it could be, there could be many reasons behind this, right? Or that could be that there's certain ideas are too toxic, that they're just not feasible. And maybe there's a kind of a detoxing process that happens with Pluto as well, right? And that's kind of like the idea that extremist, there could be like something interesting happening where we have this sort of rise of political extremism, but then we find out that it doesn't, like, people make a lot of noise, but it doesn't really work, because the more extreme you are, the less likely you are to form a coalition. And then after that, you have to get on with life and leave your ideas behind, and then some other asshole is going to pick them up and either try to do something with them, or else maybe be like, this stuff is too toxic, we're just going to have to, we're going to have to seal this off in a vault, and protect people from these toxic ideas that aren't going to be helpful, right? Okay, well, that's about time, I guess. Thanks for watching. Tune in for more later. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for supporting the channel. Do.